I've never met a single person in this country that wants to destroy the earth on behalf of development. And in fact, anybody I've ever met, Indigenous or non, wants to do the opposite and do it correctly.
Why don't you first just tell, I actually don't know that much about how you, well, I know where you grew up, but how you grew up and what that was like and everything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Sankey. I grew up in a community called Loch Hualams. It means Island of Roses in my culture, in our language. It's 24 miles north, 24 kilometers north of Prince Rupert. It's a membership of about just below 4,000 members. 80% of us live off reserve, 20% on, but it has increased because of cost of living. But it was a fishing town, logging town, resource-based community. We had one of the largest fishing fleets on the coast. Unfortunately, fishing, as you know, is all but evaporated. And those that stuck with it are the ones that diversified licenses, whether it's crab or halibut or cod. And so many of our fishers now are stranded. So it was a good community. It's very into sports, and yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So and what was it like to grow up, however many decades ago it was for you, back then? Was there, especially on the reserve, were you on the reserve?
I was. Yes.
Yeah. So what was that like back then?
Well, as I mentioned, it was a resource-based community, but it had its struggles. I know for myself, I won't speak for others, but for myself, the struggle was very real for my family. My parents worked in the logging and fishing and ate wherever they could. Money was tough, living was tough, but my parents did what they could in order for us to eat and survive when fishing and the forest industry went down. I lost both my parents, one when I was a very young age. I'm just one of thousands of these stories. And my mother to cancer later on in life. But you know what, there was a lot of things that they were able to teach me. I think what ended up happening was it became nurture versus nature. And somehow nature took its course, and I'm blessed to be surrounded by some very good people in my life. I've always had some really good mentors, whether I knew it or not. I always had people looking out for me. So I'm really blessed that I'm fortunate to be around some really good people.
Now, compared to how the reserve was back then in the community in general, how has that been changing over the last decades and years? And where do you see that going? Are you optimistic about the future?
I am. I have to be optimistic. I think any Indigenous person out there understands how it feels when things are a constant struggle, when it doesn't have to be. The community has changed substantially from when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we only had one paved road, and that was the road that went out to the fish plant, which at the time was called the cannery. The rest were not paved. The community itself, I mean, we have a nice clinic there now, a high school, more housing, infrastructure has been upgraded. I think what I'm noticing now is more of our members getting out to see the world. I think to have a job, to buy a house, to go traveling, to do the things that we only ever dreamed about when we were on the reservation. And our outlet was sports, so when we got to travel anywhere, it was really exciting to leave the community.
So you talked about some of the struggles in First Nation communities when you were growing up, and it's getting to a more optimistic place, and things are getting better. How important are good, stable, well-paying jobs in making that transition and improving the lives for First Nations people?
Oh, it's super important. I know what it's like to go hungry. My kids will never know what it was like for so many of us that grew up on the reservation, when the only employment is either the band office or it was fishing or forestry, but then that all evaporated. When a person feels like they are in control of their lives and their families' lives, that whole persona, that everything about them trickles down to their kids. And so when their kids get to see mom and dad working, bringing home a paycheck to pay the bills, that's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. That's going to be a generational effect. And it's going to help them realize that, you know what, we can make a difference. The work, that the good paying jobs that our people are getting today is unheard of. Like, I mean, they're 6 figures and up. And so when you get a group of people that used to work or were on income assistance, making maybe $10,000 for the whole year on income assistance, if that, maybe $8,000 to live, to almost six figures, it's a massive transition.
And how important are or what role do resources and resource development play in that, especially in these remote or relatively remote northern British Columbian and central British Columbian communities?
Massive. I can't stress that enough. Look, fishing and forestry were massive for us back then. It was such a industry that exploded back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for us, and even beyond that. Energy, oil, gas, methanol is such a intricate part of how we're going to develop these communities in remote areas, as you referred to, because even though Lac Ouellan's, where I'm from, 24 miles north, it's still considered isolated. And so in order for us to get involved and help our communities grow, we could take the revenues from these major proposed projects, or like the LNG project, and we could pour it into infrastructure that is much needed infrastructure in our communities, and into healthcare, into elders units, elders to take care of our elders, for our education and well-being, our health and social health. Revitalize our culture. There's so many things that we could be doing with this money to break us away from this systemic system that has never been very good to us.
Now, certain activist groups in British Columbia and across Canada, and I might even say internationally, have tried to make the argument that resource development, and in particular pipelines, are somehow incompatible with Indigenous sovereignty. What do you say to when you hear that message?
It's frustrating as an Indigenous person to hear so many of these activists speak for First Nations. And I know there are First Nations that are against development, but would they have been involved in such protests if these activists didn't come there to cause such a disruption? It's a new time. It's a new era. Not everybody along the pipe agreed with the pipe, even though they supported it. But we need revenues. We need dollars to come back in to help our communities prosper, so our people could feel good about themselves, and to bring our community and our poverty, get people out of poverty, and bring our community to another level. So when the activist groups do stuff like this, you're not helping us. And we make that very clear. Like, these groups aren't helping Indigenous people. It's affecting families. Families have fought each other. Friends have known one another forever, have distanced themselves from one another. It's happened to me. And for what? Because I want to help our people. And the activists have painted this narrative that all Indigenous people are against development. That is unequivocally not true. Indigenous people are for responsible resource development, period. And you're never going to get everybody to come to consensus on that. But that's what democracy's for. But the problem is that you have a small group of activists going all over the countryside trying to speak for everybody, and they're trying to make it look like everybody that is Indigenous is against development, and that is simply not true.
And do you think that some of these activists are using First Nations, using Indigenous Canadians to kind of achieve an ulterior agenda?
I do. What they've done, and for me as an Indigenous person who grew up in poverty, who's proud of his culture, to watch somebody from the outside take that narrative and play to the heartstrings of Canadians, and you take our culture, you take our language, you take our history, and you use it for your own benefit, that's an insult to us. And Indigenous people know how to speak for ourselves. We're more than capable of taking care of ourselves. But what they're doing is wrong, and it needs to stop. I think it's not only hurt us as Indigenous people on our growth and opportunity to prosperity, it's hurt Canadians in general. It's hurt us in general in terms of trying to grow and change the course of the country. And so far, we've not been able to do that to get, for example, product to new markets. That's hurting Canada. We're losing billions because of that. And these activist groups that come in from the States and other parts of the country to come and try to speak for us and claim, that's wrong, and it needs to stop.
And I can only imagine, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. You're up in Prince Rupert. close to all of these communities where, in this case, the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the LNG facility in Kitimat are affecting. And I think you mentioned people in Prince Rupert actually work down there.
Yep.
And basically you wake up in, I think it was January or February 2020, and you see these protests, wall-to-wall coverage, Victoria, Vancouver, then spread out across the country. Honestly, let's be frank, a majority of them white protesters that are out there talking about how this is somehow against Aboriginal rights and that they are the true and only voice of First Nations people. What does that feel like to you? You're actually in these communities where this is happening. You're First Nations. You grew up in the poverty. What is that like? How do you feel when you saw it?
Have you ever lived on a reserve?
Yeah.
Right? Come on. People that go out there, which you're right, the majority of them were non-Indigenous people that have never lived in a reserve. Even a lot of urban First Nations that have never lived on the reserve, and rightfully so. Their parents said, you know what, I need a better life for my children, so I'm going to move to the city. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But for these activists to go out there, and what I witnessed this past year, it was infuriating to me because I felt like our voice collectively across the country as Indigenous people was taken from us when we were trying to build that story, being methodical and being smart about coming together, and just like that, they took it. And I know I speak to a lot of Indigenous people that don't voice their concern. The majority of them want resource development. They want responsible resource development. And they're quiet, and they're now starting to come and use their voice. But to take our culture, to take our history, to speak for us and go to the media constantly and use us, I feel completely disrespected as an Indigenous person, and so should other Indigenous people. Now, granted, look, we're our stewards of the land. There are Indigenous people out there that understand that it's so important to them, the land, the water, the air. They get that. It's important to them, and we need to make sure that's addressed all the time. And Indigenous people want to be a part of that. I've never met a single person in this country that wants to destroy the earth on behalf of development. And in fact, anybody I've ever met, Indigenous or non, wants to do the opposite and do it correctly. So that's the voice that you never hear in the media. It's very frustrating now for me. It's sad in a way because you have such a huge population of very smart Indigenous people. They understand what needs to happen, and collectively they could do it, but the interference by the NGOs, interference by these activists, I feel anyway, has prevented their opportunity to move forward as a collective.
And I think you also hit the nail on the head there with this narrative that has been created and amplified over and over again by the media that paints, First Nations as this monolithic group that are against development. But of course, many First Nations work already in the energy and resource sector. And I was wondering, I know you have some experience in this sector. So what's that experience been like for you?
Well, my kids get to have the things that I never ever had. We get to travel. We have a house. We have a home. My wife works. She's a teacher. She's an educator. My kid is looking to come to UVic actually to move to Victoria, and it's been unbelievable. I tell my kid all the time, think globally but act locally. The Fairmont model, and understand that you are capable of doing anything you want in this world now. I never ever imagined that I'd be sitting in the two towers in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, speaking to one of the largest energy giants.
Yeah.
I never imagined being able to get in front of some of the largest major oil and gas producers and sit down with their executive team to talk about a relationship. I mean, that's something we always fought for, and yet we're blocking that. Everything we always said we wanted, the activists are blocking that very fight we had for freaking 150 years. And now it's here, and now's the time to come together. We need to come together, we need to work together, because together we are truly stronger.
Couldn't agree more, and I think that probably applies both in Aboriginal communities and then in the larger communities in the province and the country as a whole. Now, I also wanted to shift gears a little bit. You were an elected councillor.
I was.
I find a lot of Canadians don't know how these councils work.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could kind of share that experience. I know Alice Ross was telling me that it can be, First Nations politics can be pretty rough and tumble, as much or more so than than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Do you want to kind of share that experience?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, it was an honor and privilege to be elected for my community for 2 terms. I decided to pull the pin to get back into the private sector, plus there was other reasons why I felt it was time to move. But being on a council for Lac Galams and Indigenous council in general, you got to go in there with tough skin, man. I always tell Ellis this, and him and I had this conversation, that non-Indigenous government officials got to get tougher. Because I'm telling you, when you go into a council meeting with any First Nation council, man, you're working beside family members. You're working beside people you've known all your life, and then if there's concerns or issues, or if you got to address difficult topics, you're dealing with your own family members. You're dealing with your friends. There's a dispute happening in the community, say on housing or education. The people you are talking to are your friends. These are people. It's not some stranger that voted for me off the street. I know this guy. I know this woman. So the Indigenous politic world it's emotional. It's lots of pride, very big on culture and language, and they want to see what's best for their community. Sometimes it's a real battle to get some things done, and I find a lot of it is because they're just really worried about the direction the community might be going. And so I think my advice to people that are on Indigenous councils is just make your decision. Make an informed decision with the best available information to you, and then move forward with it. You're not going to satisfy everybody. That's just not the way it works, right? And I think my biggest downfall, when I wanted to make everybody happy, I wanted to get everybody, bring everyone together like tomorrow, and that didn't work. But now, fast forward almost 10 years later, I find now all my messaging, not just my messaging, but other councillors' messages, we need to be part of opportunity here. We need to move forward collectively. We're tired of seeing our people struggle financially.
And what do you say, again, because on a bunch of the protests that I've attended or covered, it would be a better adjective to use, one of the constant refrains from these activists is when you talk about all of the elected councils and chiefs supporting the Coastal GasLink pipeline, for instance, or the vast majority supporting TMX, is that elected councillors and chiefs are illegitimate because they're tools of the Indian Act and colonialism, and basically any decisions that you make or voices that you have aren't worth the paper that they're written on. What do you say to that kind of, to me, that would be offensive. You put your name forward, you served your community, presumably you did so alongside others that were doing the exact same thing, and yet you hear this constant refrain, kind of this dismissal of the elected chiefs and councils.
Yeah. Frustrated. Look, I don't disagree that the system itself has never been the best, because we are an arm of this Indian Act and we're elected, but the governing body is what oversees the community. You need to understand that when they make these comments, they're only thinking about the development part of the actual, on the land of the traditional territory. They're only thinking about the business. They don't understand that the elected body, first of all, holds all of that in trust for the communities. But they don't understand we got to deal with addiction, suicide, homelessness, mental health, education. There's all those other factors that they don't understand. You can't just come in and say, well, you know what, you're irrelevant because somehow you've jumped on the topic of hereditary. I'm a part of a hereditary system. I've taken over from my uncle's house group, which is House Woodine in the Gitwil tribe. And so for them to understand, before they make comments like that, they need to actually understand just what the responsibilities of the government, the elected body for that community is. You're literally overseeing everything for everybody, right down from the kitchen sink to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar impact benefits agreement. So it's important that they understand that. You can't dispel that. Now, that said, if we had a hereditary system that was properly functioning, that had things in place properly, and that we could collectively work together, perhaps the hereditary system could be like a Senate. And that's something that I think a lot of leaders are talking about, where there's a Senate of hereditary leaders that when decisions are made, it goes to the Senate for consideration and input. I think there's a play there. I really do, because I think you have to work with the hereditary system. I know in the past we have tried to do that, and I think they're still going to try to do that. And I hope it works. I really do. But it's going to take decades. It's going to take so long. You're talking 150 to 200 years of this system that has never worked. It's not going to just change like that overnight.
Now, another thing that I'm curious about how you feel personally is different groups, the Green Party, some of these NGOs, they really kind of try to, I find, build their platform almost on top of First Nations people and kind of articulate that ideological view of the world through that lens. And the media, I find, really carries and amplifies that narrative. But do you find your life experience, your narrative, what you've learned through life, how you view the energy sector and your experience with it, do you find people are giving voice to that? Like, do you feel that you have somebody out there kind of amplifying that worldview, or do you kind of feel like sometimes that you're alone on Twitter trying to get that message out? It's you versus the world almost kind of a thing.
No, I think the message is getting out there that, well, look, there's no secret that I am not a fan of the Green Party. I'm not a fan of them because I feel they use these NGOs as a mechanism to help their party platform. They're not really there. It's been such a division of what they've done. And I have no problem saying that. I make no apologies to the Green Party and what they've done to this province and country, because it's their allies in these NGOs that I feel have been completely disruptive and hurtful to our community's progress around getting out of prosperity. The Green Party aren't any better than these activists. They've actually done more harm because of the narrative that they're able to put out there in the mainstream media is simply incorrect. That the majority of First Nations people are for responsible development, for responsible resource development. So when I hear the party, I can't distinguish them between government officials and activists. They're together on all of this. When you talk about Rebellion Extinction and all these other organizations, that's an arm of the Green Party. And I completely disagree that voting British Columbians have allowed that to happen. I mean, so many of the communities that rely on resource development, like you had mentioned, are in remote areas. So when someone's living in Victoria here or in Vancouver or the suburbs, they don't understand. Like, that's their way they're gonna make their living. And they don't have a lot of options whatsoever. And so for the Green Party to come out and activists to come out to speak like as if they have all sat down together with us and held hands and said that we're going to do this together, that's simply not true. Now, that said, there are Indigenous people that support the Green Party. That's fine. That's their choice. That's what democracy for. I, on the other hand, and so many other Indigenous people do not support them. They support development. Plain and simple. They want to see their people get out of poverty. They want to see a good, livable wage, which is happening. Like I said, there's port-related development. There's LNG Canada. There's revenues. I see Heisel is a very an unbelievable prime example. And there's many more out there. In order to do that, it was a private sector that made that happen. Regardless if it was port-related developments, LNG, oil, it's the private sector that's helping our people today.
Now, one other thoughtful question I have for you is many of these same activists have been, not just advocating on the resource side, they're part of all of these different advocacy groups. And one of the things that they've been advocating, kind of their, overarching campaign for what they call as racial justice, has to do with the cancel culture, has to do with tearing down statues, all toward what they kind of see as big picture reconciliation. Do you think these tactics have helped or hurt reconciliation over the past few years?
I think the intention of what they are doing, I get it. I don't necessarily agree with it. When I think back in the history of how Indigenous people were governed, and I see the statues of the people that implemented a system that actually hurt us, I used to feel sad in a sense, but now it went from fresh frustration to understanding that we are in a different time. And I think that it would be important for my kid to know that if they seen it such a statue, that they would know the history. And I think that doing what defacing statues is not helping us. I don't think we didn't like it when it was done to us and our totem poles and our culture being shipped off into some museum. So why should we be vandalizing and defacing statues? I didn't agree with a lot of what those leaders did to Indigenous people, not at all. But I don't want the history lost, because it's that very struggle is what I do today and what so many of us do today because of the system that those leaders put on us. So I want to make sure that never dies. That says, you know what, you did try to desecrate us, the system, and it didn't work. But I want my kid to know that we're better than that. That doing two wrongs don't make a right.
And learning from history instead of erasing it seems to be what you're saying in a lot of ways.
I think that, and that's just my opinion, that I think there should be more totem poles raised within our respective communities. I think there should be more statues of Indigenous leaders paving the way, breaking down barriers. There's so many of them out there that I admire so much, that they're setting a standard, and they're raising the standard of living for their people. And those people need to be celebrated. Those leaders need to be celebrated, just as the statues of, say, John A. Macdonald was celebrated. And so that way, collectively, the history that once hurt us could now come to light with our history that exists today.
Agreed. In some ways, it's almost a microcosm of life where, you can add more positivity, erect more statues, or just tear everything down. Yeah. And it seems like it's almost the answer is self-evident. One final question for you. Sure. You've had quite the life, and you've seen things obviously at bad times, and you've seen them get gradually better. And now you're here, clearly a symbol of success for your community. How does that make you feel? I assume it makes you feel proud. I know you're the father of three kids.
Yes. Yep.
So how does that make you feel, and where do we go from here?
First, thank you. I feel very proud from where I was and where I've gotten to, but I didn't do that alone. I always believe that you should never forget those that have given you the chance to get to where you are, and I'm one of them. I'm a prospect of somebody who gave me a chance, whether they are First Nation or non. And I'm proud that I'm able today to stand before you and before all you fine folks to talk about it, because that's what we're trying to achieve. This is what we've always wanted, is to be a part of Canada, not apart from it, and to show that we are just as much a part of this country with all Canadians. And I'm trying to change the status quo by getting into the private sector and providing employment, providing a path forward so that guys like you and me could sit down and have these conversations without screaming at each other. And I think what myself and so many of us are doing is we're bridging the relationship that was much needed 150 years ago. It's happening now. It's all coming full circle, that we're in the greatest probably opportunity in the history of our people than ever before. So let's go out and grab it and go forward together. Like, together we're stronger. You and I, together we're stronger. We're human beings. We both bleed red.
Exactly. I
happen to have a culture. You have a history I don't know about that I would like to get to know, and just never know. We'll have more in common than not.
Exactly. I mean, it's as you rightly said, everybody is kind of stronger together. I think that connects all the different things we talked about, from resource development to having these important conversations to building everybody up instead of tearing everybody down. Yeah. I think it just makes more sense. And thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
You're very welcome. Again, look, it's a teaching moment. Yeah. And Indigenous people, they just want to be understood.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
Yeah. Real pleasure.
Awesome.
Yeah.